you very much for inviting me. Tonight I'm going to be talking about Saudi Arabia and the UK's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the humanitarian catastrophe which Saudi forces have unleashed on the people of Yemen over the last 2 years, and the UK's complicity within that humanitarian catastrophe. The way I'm going to discuss it tonight is to first of all discuss the context of the bombing and the context of the UK's relationship. Then I'm going to look at some of the myths which are used to underpin that relationship, a lot of the arguments that the government makes in order to justify itself. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the ongoing court cases some of you are hopefully aware of, which Campaign Against Arms Trade has taken to stop UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. There's limitations on what I can say about that because it is actually being considered by 2 High Court judges as we speak. The hearings took place 2 weeks ago and we're expecting a verdict at some point in the 3 or 4 weeks ahead. Whatever happens, it's going to be a very important result and it's going to set a very important precedent. So I'm going to talk a bit about that towards the end and a bit about some of the other things which we've been doing. But right from the start of the Saudi bombardment of Yemen, which began almost exactly 2 years ago, the morning after the first bombs fell, Philip Hammond, who was then the Foreign Secretary before he has now become Chancellor, set out the UK's position very clearly. He pledged that the UK would, in his exact words, support the Saudi campaign in every way possible except combat. And of course he stayed very true to that promise. It's one of those promises which politicians have not broken, and it's one of those promises which he has stuck to resolutely. And one of the ways in which this has been done has been through the sale of arms, because UK weapons have underpinned this bombardment. But of course, to an arms company or to an arms dealer, warring conflict is what keeps their industry thriving. If world peace broke out tomorrow, then BAE Systems would be the first company to go out of business. The entire industry would go out of business. In fact, in their annual reports every year, you can see where they're talking about the pros and cons facing their company in the year ahead and the difficulties they might face. They do actually present war as an opportunity. And it's well worth remembering this because they have been able to make a lot of money out of this bombardment. In the 2 years since the bombing began, the UK has licensed over £3 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. That is £2 billion worth of the same fighter jets which are flying overhead, which are Eurofighter Typhoons. And it's over £1 billion worth of bombs and missiles which are falling from the sky, some of which have been linked to specific violations of international humanitarian law, some of which have been linked to the destruction of civilian targets. Right now, UK-made fighter jets, which are made in this country, are flying UK-trained military personnel, because the UK does a lot of military training for the Saudi Air Force as well. Right now, UK-trained personnel are dropping UK-made bombs from UK-made planes. In all ways, the UK is actually a very active participant in this conflict. As I said, it's one thing Philip Hammond has stayed very true to since he said those words 2 years ago. In that time, over 10,000 people have been killed. According to the UN, the majority of these people have been killed by the airstrikes. They've been killed by the Saudi-led bombardment. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have been displaced across Yemen. We've seen the destruction of entire communities. We've seen hospitals and schools have become the sites of massacres. Even funerals have become the sites of massacres. Last October, for example, saw the bombing of one funeral which killed over 140 people. Despite this, the arms sales have continued. According to UNICEF, 1 child is dying in Yemen every 10 minutes from preventable causes. The reason for this is because war doesn't just take a toll in terms of the immediate death count. It can also break down entire communities. It can break down vital civilian infrastructure. It can lead to people dying of things which they would not be dying of in peacetime. And a lot of that has to be on the conscience of governments who have supported this every step of the way, who in Philip Hammond's words have supported it in every way except providing combat troops. We've even seen revelations in the last 3 months that cluster bombs have been used. UK-made cluster bombs, which were sold in the 1980s and 1990s. Even by the standard of weapons, cluster bombs are a particularly awful weapon. They're indiscriminate. When they explode, they can explode into hundreds of little kind of separate bombs which come from one bomb, and they can cover areas the size of football fields when they break apart. You don't know where they're going to end up. You don't know who might end up being hit by them. You don't know what will happen to them once they are used. But one thing we can say for sure is that despite all of the protestations we're hearing from the Saudi government, from the Saudi Air Force, any government that is and Air Force that is prepared to use cluster bombs is not one that's doing everything it can to avoid civilian casualties. It's not one which is doing everything it can to make sure that it isn't killing civilians and that it isn't destroying infrastructure. It suggests that actually it's an indiscriminate bombing fought by an army which doesn't care who it affects and doesn't care how they're affected. The UN has conducted small-scale investigations, all of which have accused Saudi forces of violating international humanitarian law routinely. In fact, one report used the word systematically to describe it, identifying over 120 breaches of international humanitarian law within the space of 1 month. However, there have been calls for a full and thorough international investigation, all of which have been resisted by governments, including the UK. Instead, the UK has depended on the reports which are released by the Saudi-led coalition itself, which has set up its own watchdog to monitor itself for war crimes. And of course, needless to say, its reports are always very positive. They always come back saying that Saudi Arabia is taking the utmost care to ensure that civilians aren't being hit and that they aren't doing anything which is in violation of international humanitarian law. And wherever there are shortcomings, they are, of course, learning from these shortcomings. It's this kind of whitewash which we're seeing being put out, and that is what the UK government has been relying on, not just in Parliament, but also in court, which is a point I'm going to get to towards the end of this talk. But it does raise a very serious question, which is how can a regime with a human rights record, which is as poor as that of Saudi Arabia, be trusted to investigate itself for war crimes? We're talking about a government which has consistently shown itself to have a total disregard for human rights. How can we believe that if they don't observe the human rights of people in Saudi Arabia, that they're going to be doing everything they can to observe the human rights of people in Yemen? It doesn't strike me as at all realistic. I think the words ring incredibly hollow. But behind this military support has been a very strong and uncritical political support, which I feel has been just as vital to the bombardment and just as vital to the relationship between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia. That military support has been complemented by this support which has been manifested through the uncritical backing of the war and the excuses peddled out by ministers like Philip Hammond, who I quoted earlier on. And it's something which hasn't just been specific to this government. This isn't something Theresa May has invented. It's not something which David Cameron has invented. It's something which has been a UK policy for probably the best part of 60 years now. It happened in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was selling fighter jets in deals which were worth hundreds of billions of pounds, and it was the case when Tony Blair cancelled a serious fraud office investigation into corruption in those exact arms deals. It's something which was present when Tony Blair signed another major fighter jet deal, which came very shortly after he cancelled a serious fraud office investigation into corruption in the last set of fighter jet sales. It's something which was present when Gordon Brown invited the Saudis to make a state visit to the UK, and it was something which was present when Prince Charles took part in a sword dance, which you've possibly seen the photos of, which are incredibly embarrassing for him. But he took part in a traditional Saudi sword dance at an event organised by BAE Systems the day before Saudi Arabia signed a new contract with BAE Systems. So what we have seen is the full infrastructure of government, including the heir to the throne, being used to push arms sales for BAE Systems. And now, to this backdrop, it's highly unlikely that the same government which is pulling out all stops to sell weapons on behalf of arms companies is going to be politically critical. We haven't seen the UK raising objections to the appalling human rights abuses which take place in Saudi Arabia every day. We haven't seen the UK raising objections to the despicable character of the war which Saudi Arabia has fought against Yemen. And this is where there is that hypocrisy, which is at the heart of foreign policy. It's a foreign policy where some dictators are to be condemned, and I say quite right too, but others are to be cozied up to. It's one where human rights matter in some countries, but not in others. And it's where we see that double standard, which is applied all around the world. And I think Saudi Arabia is the most blatant case of this. It's that hypocrisy at the heart of foreign policy. For example, the UK does not sell weapons to Russia, does not sell weapons to Syria, does not sell weapons to Iran, it does not sell weapons to North Korea. We're not suggesting that the UK should sell weapons to any of these countries. Obviously, at Campaign Against Arms Trade, we most certainly believe that they should not. However, it's very hard to make an argument that the human rights record of Russia, as bad as it is worse than that of Bahrain or that of Saudi Arabia. So there's an incredibly obvious double standard at play here, and we're going to see it actually later this month when the security and policing arms fair takes place in Farnborough just outside London, and we will see many of these regimes in attendance. We will see large-scale delegations who are invited to Britain for the sole purpose of buying weapons. Now, I want to take a look at some of the arguments which we come up against quite a lot, and some of the myths which are used to justify this relationship. We often hear the UK government making the argument that as long as we're sitting around the table, we can have a positive influence. It's an argument that as long as we are working with the government in Saudi Arabia, they will take our considerations on board and they will make sure to up their game on human rights and to fight a better, more ethical war in Yemen. Now, of course, this misses the power balance in the relationship, because in the relationship between the UK and Saudi Arabia, the power is very much of Saudi Arabia. It is the buyer. It is the one which is purchasing the weapons. It is the one which is fishing for the political support. And as long as the UK is selling these weapons and giving that political support, it can't condemn its ally. That would make clear that there was a hypocrisy at the heart of foreign policy. It couldn't be doing that. So in reality, it doesn't provide the UK influence. All it does is it buys silence and it buys complicity. And we've seen that revealed many times over. A perfect example was last year when the Guardian newspaper revealed that Saudi Arabia, that UK civil servants had lobbied for Saudi Arabia to get onto the UN Human Rights Council, which has to be said would be an incredibly ironic and slightly amusing appointment if it wasn't such a serious matter. It was also present when The Independent revealed that on the UK's anti-death penalty, international anti-death penalty strategy, that the only major death penalty state not mentioned in it was Saudi Arabia, which also happens to be on some years the second most prolific in the world and some years the third most prolific. So this is where we're seeing where the compromises can come in. This is where we see where the shortcomings are in that argument. According to the Economist Democracy Index, Saudi Arabia is the fifth most oppressive government in the world. This is despite 40 years of supposedly positive UK engagement. If after 40 years of UK engagement, it is still the fifth most oppressive regime in the world, that tells you what the character of that engagement has been, or how unsuccessful it has been. We're also told that working with Saudi Arabia is necessary and supporting them is necessary because it keeps the streets of London safe. This is an argument we've heard time and again. David Cameron cited it a lot. Theresa May has cited it many times in her first few months in office. Tony Blair cited it. It's that argument that as long as we're working with Saudi Arabia, they will help us to stop terrorism in London. And it sounds convincing at first. But Saudi Arabia is UN bound to share that information. It's not something they do because they want to. It's something they do because they have to. And if the inference of that argument is that if the UK was not selling billions of pounds worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia every year, then Saudi Arabia would stop sharing information, then that raises questions about what kind of ally it really is to begin with as a government. It raises a very serious moral question because we would never make the allegation that the Saudi government would turn a blind eye to evidence of atrocities which could be committed in the UK. But the UK government appears to be making that argument, and appears to be making the argument that the only way to make the Saudi government cooperate on matters of stopping international terrorism is to sell them billions of pounds worth of weapons. And we can't get to a position where that is considered acceptable. We can't get to a position whereby our cooperation with countries on international issues is determined by how many weapons are sold. It's simply not a sensible argument for the UK to be making. We're also told that this relationship is vital for jobs. We're told that it's particularly following Britain's departure from the European Union, manufacturing is on its knees, and we need the arms trade, and we need to be selling weapons to Saudi. We're always told that we may not like it, but it's an important industry, and it's what keeps Britain as a rich country. Of course, this is to totally overstate the number of jobs in the sector. Arms exports account for roughly 0.2% of jobs in the UK economy. That is 0.2. And that is despite the absolutely massive voice these companies carry in the corridors of power. It's despite the huge influence which they have over policy and decision making. They account for roughly 1.5% of manufacturing exports from the UK as well. We're not talking about a major powerhouse of an industry. We're talking about actually a very small one. It is a small industry, but it is one with very highly skilled workers in it. That much is true. And what we need to be seeing is an industrial strategy which can use these people's skills for good, which can put them into good productive industries, into sustainable industries, into a kind of industries which benefit our country rather than the kind which directly benefit from war and conflict, and the kind which fuel war, and the kind which can be linked to war crimes. It's an argument which suggests that British manufacturing is overly dependent on arms sales to dictatorships. And if that is the case, that tells us that it's manufacturing policy that needs to be changed. It doesn't tell us that we need to be putting even more resources into a small industry which is not employing people but can have terrible consequences around the world. And of course, the issue is much wider than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not the only country with an appalling human rights record which the UK is routinely selling weapons to. In fact, the UK arms a number of authoritarian regimes all around the world. At present, 2/3 of UK arms sales are going into the Middle East, which is obviously a small region and one which has far too many weapons in it to begin with. And of course, there can be no such thing as arms control in a war zone. We don't know where these weapons will end up. We don't know who they're going to be used by. We don't know who they're going to be used against. There was an interesting investigation by the Sunday Times last year which found UK weapons sold to Russia in the 1990s being used in Syria by Syrian forces, which tells you that actually the lifespan of a weapon is longer than that of the government it's sold to. A lifespan of a weapon is longer than the political context it's sold into. We also saw this when the UK was among those governments which were arming Colonel Gaddafi to the teeth in the period from 2004 through to the bombardment in 2011. And of course, when the uprisings took place in Libya, Colonel Gaddafi turned European weapons on Libyan people. And it wasn't a surprise if you're selling weapons to somebody who does not observe human rights, and it can't be a surprise when they use those weapons. And this is one thing which has been central to this. We don't know all the weapons which are being sold now, the billions of pounds worth of weapons being sold around the world. We don't know who they're going to be used against. I mentioned earlier on the cluster bombs which had been used in Yemen. And I can imagine when these were sold in the 1980s, nobody had any idea that they might one day in the far future be dropped on a village in North Yemen. Nobody knew that when they were making them. Nobody knew this is how they will be used, this is who they will be used against. But there is a shelf life to weapons, and there is no such thing as arms control in a war zone. And that's what makes it particularly worrying that since the uprisings in 2011, arms exports to a number of those countries have only increased. We've seen this in Bahrain, where there's been an ongoing crackdown by the Bahraini royal family. We've seen this in Egypt, where despite the instability, despite the repression, despite the coups, arms sales have continued and have actually more than trebled within the period of time since the uprisings in 2011. And another example to cite is that of Israel, because in 2014, when Israel was bombing Gaza in Operation Protective Edge, UK arms were used in that bombardment. This was revealed by the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, who I think's exact words were, "It was very likely," and cited 12 licenses for weapons with which it was very likely these had been used. Since that bombardment ended, the UK, despite acknowledging that these had been used against people in Gaza, and despite acknowledging similarly in 2009 that UK weapons had been used against people of Gaza in wars which were immoral and deadly. Despite this, since the bombing ended in 2014, the UK's licensed over £100 million worth of weapons to Israel. And if there is another bombardment of Gaza in the future, we can be almost certain that UK weapons will play a part in that as well. And then the cycle will continue. In one place in which this cycle is generated, in which the wheels of the arms trade get oiled, is at the Dicey Arms Fair, which takes place every 2 years in London. It's due to take place actually this September. It's going to take place in the Excel Centre in East London next to Stratford. That is one of the biggest arms fairs in the world. It sees thousands of delegates. It sees regimes from around the world who are invited in order to rub shoulders with the biggest arms companies in the world. If you go onto our website, you can see the guest list at previous events, but it's a lot of governments which simply should not be trusted with the means to kill, and are being invited specifically for the sole purpose of selling them as many weapons as possible. So I want to look at a couple of the outcomes. One of the outcomes which I mentioned earlier is that it can warp government policy, and we did see that with the example I gave of the UK lobbying to get Saudi Arabia onto the UN Human Rights Council. And we saw it again when a UK Prime Minister intervened to stop a serious fraud office investigation into corruption in arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's also caused the UK to ignore the human rights situation in Yemen. In effect, what the government is telling us is that the European Parliament is wrong, Amnesty International is wrong, Oxfam is wrong, the UN expert panels are wrong, the MSF is wrong, every single reputable NGO with people on the ground is wrong when they tell us that Saudi forces are violating international humanitarian law. It's telling us that, in fact, the Saudi Air Force is right, that they're the ones who can be trusted above all others. It tells us that, in that respect, foreign policy is for sale. And this compliance has resulted in a number of interesting revelations which have come out in our court case, which I'll come back to slightly later. But a very interesting example was also last summer. On the last hour of the last day of the parliamentary session, which ended in July, we saw, wheeled out very quickly and quietly, an announcement from the then Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary, that in fact almost everything his predecessors had said about the scrutiny of the war in Yemen was wrong. Where previously it had been said that the UK had investigated if weapons were being used in violation of international humanitarian law, the official parliamentary record was corrected to say that investigations hadn't taken place at all, but Saudi Arabia had been urged to hold them. There were other such revelations. In fact, there were 7 or 8, all of which are handily available on our website, but also on the Parliamentary Answers website as well. And this tells us the extent to which even Parliament and the record given to Parliament can be distorted. Make no mistake about it, Saudi Arabia's political and military strength has been underpinned by the support it gets from countries like the UK, has been underpinned by support it gets from countries like the US. What they have done in Yemen and what they do at home would simply not be possible without it. And it's to this backdrop that Campaign Against Arms Trade began a legal action, which I'm hoping some of you are already aware of, but if not, it was bubbling under for a long time. One thing we've learned through this process is that the law takes a long time. It was December 2015 when we first started writing to the government to threaten them with legal action, which was in relation to the huge number of reports coming out of reputable NGOs telling us that Saudi forces were routinely violating international humanitarian law. And of course, I should say UK arms export control on paper is very clear. Section 2C of the UK arms export control laws tell us that if there is a clear risk that weapons might be used in a serious violation of international humanitarian law, then an arms sale should not go ahead. As Saudi has been routinely accused of very serious violations of international humanitarian law by almost everybody with observers on the ground, then it raises the question of how much more serious that risk needs to be. This was when we began the legal action. We began it actually before the market bombing, which killed over 100 people last June. We began it before the bombing of a funeral, which killed 150 people last October. We began it before a lot of the atrocities which we've seen. And those have only, we believe, strengthened our case. We'd much rather be in a position where we hadn't had to make this case, obviously. But the verdict is going to be crucial, because right now, BAE Systems has publicly said in its results, in its 2016 results, which were published last week, that it is currently in negotiations to sell a new set of fighter jets, to sell even more of the same ones which are flying over Yemen right now. And if we lose in court, we can be guaranteed that the government will put everything it can into securing those sales. If we win, it could set a vital precedent. It could set an extremely important precedent. And it shouldn't. It shouldn't be a precedent that the UK has to follow its own laws. But it would be. And that in itself is quite telling. Our legal action has seen the relationship examined, scrutinised and exposed in a way which has never happened before. I would urge all of you to look up the articles, in particular by Alice Ross at The Guardian, who was in court every day and wrote up excellent pieces which tell you about what came out. We can't offer an opinion on anything which did come out because that would be contempt of court and highly illegal. But I can certainly urge you to read a lot of reports which have been written about it. All of the documents which we're legally allowed to publish are all on our website as well, so you can read them for yourselves, and it's fascinating. There's long chains of emails between ministers and civil servants, including Boris Johnson, Liam Fox and others, about the decision-making process. We have testimony coming from very senior civil servants, some of whom were concerned about the legality of the arms sales themselves. And all of them are available to read on our website, so I would definitely urge you to do that. But whatever the verdict, it is going to set a vitally important precedent. Because if we lose, the message which it sends is that a country can create a humanitarian catastrophe in a neighbouring country. It can kill 10,000 people plus. It can bomb schools, it can bomb hospitals, it can bomb markets, it can bomb funerals, and it can still be the world's largest buyer of UK weapons. And the message that sends is a terrible one. There are other reasons to be hopeful in this, as well as our legal action. And one of those is that there has been a growing opposition, with it, not just within the media, but in Parliament as well, where we have seen the SNP, Labour and Liberal Democrats take up. I mentioned earlier this has always been an institutional issue, but that's actually starting to change and it's becoming more of a party political one. We're seeing MPs from all parties, including the Conservatives actually, starting to really question if this relationship is one they want to maintain, and starting to question if the UK should be selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and should be fueling this conflict. There's still far more to do, because particularly in the aftermath of Brexit, I'm not bothered about how anybody in this room voted whatsoever. I hope you all voted, though. But in the aftermath of Brexit, what we have seen is a move away from Europe and towards the Gulf. We've seen Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liam Fox routinely making visits to the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, Boris Johnson, I think, is actually in Egypt right now. He certainly was earlier this week. We've also seen £100 million worth of fighter jets sold to Turkey as well. So it's fairly obvious that it's fairly obvious that pushing weapons is going to be top of the agenda. When we saw Theresa May visit the Gulf, the GCC meetings in the Gulf with Bahrain and Oman and Saudi and others, she couldn't have been clearer. She said that they were among the most important of relationships. She said that it was these old relationships which were going to be crucial ones they wanted to strengthen. So especially in particular, if we lose this court case, we can only assume that there will be even more of a push put onto those countries and put onto selling weapons into those countries. And ultimately, if there's a conclusion to all of this, it's that politics has to be about choices. You can talk a good game on human rights and democracy. You can talk about promoting it abroad. But when it comes down to it, you can't possibly be fighting for those who are being brutally bombed and tortured at the same time as you're selling the bombs and you're supporting the torturers. Ultimately, politics is about that choice. And the UK is a country which carries influence on the world stage. It is one where what Theresa May says matters, what Theresa May says has consequences abroad. And ultimately, it's a choice for Theresa May as well. Is she with the torture victims? Is she with the torturers? Is she with those who are being bombed in Yemen, or is she with those who are bombing them? I'm very clear on what our views are on this. Imagine you guys are all very clear on your views, and unfortunately, I think she's also very clear on hers. Thank you very much for listening. I'm more than happy to field any questions, discuss this all in more detail. And thank you very much. Thanks.
We have some time for questions.
Unfortunately, I missed who we and us is when you were talking. Who do you represent?
I'm from Campaign Against Arms Trade. I would urge you all to visit caat.org.uk for more details, but it's Campaign Against Arms Trade. I should have said that right at the start, actually. That seems like a fairly glaring omission.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. I was taken aback when you said how small the arms industry is in the UK. So where does the hold of the arms industry over the government and the policy come from?
Well, in Robin Cook, who was a former Foreign Secretary under Tony Blair, in Robin Cook's autobiography, he describes BAE Systems as having the backdoor key to Downing Street. I don't think he actually literally meant that BAE's executives would come into the back garden of Downing Street. What he was meaning was that they did carry a massive influence over Tony Blair. He also, in the same book, Point of Departure, said that Tony Blair wouldn't make a major foreign policy decision without having BAE Systems on board. Now, part of the reason for that is because it's been a long-term issue. The arms companies used to employ about 3 times as many people in the 1980s and had a massive influence then. And although the numbers employed by the arms companies has gone down drastically, not least because of globalisation and the fact that even weapons in the UK, about 40% of the components of them are made abroad. Not just because of globalisation, but also because of the rise of technology, meaning that a lot of the things which people used to do can now be done by machines. Despite the huge fall in the numbers of people employed by the industry, I think its influence hasn't changed. And one reason for that is in part because it's always been there, and it's institutional and legacy. But part of it is also because there is that revolving door of hundreds or thousands of people who have made that transition between the corridors of power and the corridors of the arms companies. In fact, on our website, caat.org.uk, we have a handy web browser which lists thousands of these examples. And there's always been that very strong influence. I think part of it is because it's always been there. And part of it is because the arms companies, there's certain constituencies where arms companies are very large employers. And that is because, although overall nationally it doesn't employ a massive amount of people, 0.2% of jobs, on the other hand, if you're an MP who has a constituency which happens to have a large part of those 0.2% of jobs, you're probably going to look at it slightly differently, especially if you think that they might vote the other way. So that's been a part of it as well. And part of it is because they are concentrated in areas. And of course, if there's an industrial policy which sees positive industries being put ahead of the arms trade, then of course it should be focused in those areas and using those skills. But I think that's a large part of it.
And just to come in quickly, is that the same across all parties, the influence?
A good example of the scale of influence is every year the ADS group, which is a kind of pro-arms trading body, it stands for Aerospace, Defence and Security. Every year they hold an annual dinner in central London. We managed to get the guest list to the 2015 dinner and the 2014 ones. And in both cases, you had over 40 MPs in attendance, which did include MPs from all political parties except the SNP. And I think subsequently, now that the SNP has more representation, they're probably getting lobbied by the arms companies in the same way. So it is something which has been the case in all policies. It's worth in all parties, but it is worth mentioning that Labour governments followed much the same policy as Conservative governments. Tony Blair sold just as many weapons to Saudi Arabia and would have sold more if he could. Gordon Brown did the same. When the Liberal Democrats were in coalition, Vince Cable was the minister in charge of arms exports. He signed off on a lot of the bombs that are now being used in Yemen. And he was a Liberal Democrat. I imagine the Tories would have signed off on the exact same deal had it been them with the minister, and we can only assume Labour would have done the same. As I mentioned at the end, I think that is starting to change a little bit, and I think that has been because of this particularly horrifying example we've seen in Yemen. So I would hope that regardless of the outcome of our court case and regardless of what happens in Yemen and beyond, we would hope that the MPs who are questioning it, the MPs who are raising objections, will continue to do so. And we'll obviously work with people from all parties to do so as well. Yeah.
I remember actually during our campaign against armed trade with Saddam Hussein during Thatcher time, what we did actually, we did campaign actually visiting the MPs, and we make actually, you need a number, certain number of MPs to raise a question to the government. Have you tried that? I mean, there's to embarrass the government in the House to be asked exactly about this?
Oh yes, this happens regularly actually. There are, as I mentioned, we do work with MPs from all parties, and for example, I've been in meetings where we've been discussing the issue and briefing MPs from SNP, from Labour, and I know it happens with others as well. And questions are routinely asked. And one of the interesting things about this issue and the people who have been raising objections is that it's not just the usual suspects. Taking the Labour Party, for example, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone that Jeremy Corbyn is opposed to arms sales to Saudi Arabia, because he always has been. But what has been equally important has been that the opposition has also come from voices like Hilary Benn, who you would not necessarily associate with the kind of issues Campaign Against Arms Trade campaigns on, but has been a very supportive voice in Parliament. And it's been others as well. Stephen Twigg, who would have traditionally been regarded as being on the right wing of the Labour Party, has been raising the issue and had debates called on it. So there has certainly been a lot more scrutiny in Parliament, and I think that's helped to increase the scrutiny in the media. It's just a terrible thing that it takes a humanitarian crisis for these questions to be asked and for these issues to be covered in the same way.
Just one comment, actually, since you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn. I remember actually we invited Jeremy Corbyn to one of our meetings, and he suggested very, very good, actually, line of action, which is actually could be applied here in this case. About what he suggested, that we have to draw a poster, big poster, a map of Iraq, and we put arrows actually where is arm coming to Iraq, which is mainly it was UK and US actually, as well as the Russia at that time. And I think we could do actually about Yemen, and to emphasize actually there is a huge amount of actually arms supplies or used actually British arms used in the war in Yemen, and this is that to make the public very aware about actually a number of people, children being killed in Yemen is really out of result of actually the British arms.
I think you're right. I think, and British arms can also be linked to specific atrocities that have taken place, as well as to the overall bombing. But yeah, I think you're right. I think anything that raises awareness in that way. Another issue which can tie into that, and I think was more the case with Iraq than it is with Yemen, is that another big problem is that weapons can cross borders very easily as well, and that weapons sold to one group can easily be moved on to another. A good example of this is actually when you see some of the horrifyingly upmarket technology which ISIS has. One of the reasons for that is because it's very well documented that they've seized them from the Iraqi government, or they've seized them from the groups they were originally sold to. And it is that thing again, the lifespan of a weapon being much longer than the lifespan of the conflict it's sold into, and that we don't know where these are going to end up. But I think your idea is a good one. I think those are exactly the sorts of things that need to be done, anything which can bring the issue to life and to make that link to people. And actually, this is one issue where I should say the public is on side, genuinely. Because we do polling on this quite regularly, and I always worry that it's going to be one of those times, like almost all of my other opinions on matters, where it turns out I'm hugely out of sync with the public. But actually on this one, all the polling which we've ever seen has consistently shown roughly 2/3 of people against arms sales to Saudi Arabia specifically, with only about 12% in favour, and a full 3/4 against arms exports to human rights abusing regimes more generally, and to those who've been accused of violating international humanitarian law more generally, with only about 8% in favour. Aside from questioning the moral bankruptcy of that 8%, I think what it does send is actually a very positive message about public opinion and the need to mobilise it.
Yes, a company like British Aerospace and Raytheon and Schlumberger, which supplies indicating instruments, they will say, oh, we are supplying only non-combat thing, but still they are close to defense equipment, fitted in the defense firing equipment. So as you said, these jobs, the government come up that, oh, it provides us job in Britain or wherever in United States or Germany or wherever. So they say jobs are important to us, but these jobs are for the highly educated people, and the small suppliers are also included. I know you people do good job, CAAT, fight for it, but when we lobby MP, they said, what shall I do for my constituent? So that's where it fails. And when we supply them, they said they're not supposed to use against civilian, but we have noticed countries, they do use it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's a very good comment, because I think there's a few different things to pick up from it. And if there's anything I forget, then please let me know and I'll address it. But to address the points you raised kind of individually, first of all, it is worth mentioning that companies like BAE and Raytheon do also produce some civilian goods. Not very many, and it's actually a very small percentage of their business. With BAE, it's interesting, we've got a Campaign Against Arms Trade owns shares in BAE Systems. And the reason we own shares in BAE is specifically so that we can attend their AGM. It's specifically so that we get all of their annual reports. It's well worth attending a BAE AGM, actually. I would fully recommend it to you. And if any of you want to become temporary shareholders when it happens this May, you would be more than welcome, because I think we have about 40 places. So we'll bring along some journalists and some activists, and we'll all ask them the kind of questions which they won't get asked by the normal shareholders. And it can get a bit over the top sometimes. It can get a bit angry occasionally. But I think it's something which is well worth doing, because it is about accountability at the end of the day as well. The great majority of what BAE does is military, and the great majority of their major deals are in fighter jet area. At the moment, as I mentioned towards the end, they're currently lobbying. They've been very open about this. It was reported on BBC, and it's in all of their annual reports. They've been lobbying to sell even more fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia specifically, at least it was 2 years ago, I'm reasonably sure it still is the third largest buyer in the world of BAE's weapons, behind the UK, which obviously uses BAE for its warships and things like that. And yeah, it would be very surprising if it wasn't the UK. And the other one's the US as well, and then behind, which isn't a surprise either, because BAE employs more people in the US than it does in the UK. And its third largest buyer by a country mile is Saudi Arabia. And the huge, overwhelming majority of that is military. They call it defence, we would call it military, because at the moment bombing schools and hospitals in Yemen is not defence, that is very much an attack. In terms of the next point, which you mentioned was about jobs, wasn't it? And that is that difficulty, which is if you're an MP in a constituency where there are arms company workers, you will look at it differently as an issue. It's no coincidence that the MP for Barrow and Furness, for example, is pro-BAE Systems, because they are a large employer in his constituency. There are exceptions, actually. A good exception to cite is Peter Grant, who's the SNP MP for Glenrothes. Glenrothes is in the Kingdom of Fife in Scotland, not that far from where I'm from, actually. I'm from Edinburgh. But in Glenrothes is a factory for Raytheon, which makes the Paveway 4 bombs, which have been dropped on Yemen. Peter Grant, despite having a massive Raytheon factory in the middle of his constituency, is still very much against arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and has specifically criticised Raytheon despite it being a major employer. So there are exceptions to that rule as well. And I think trying to get those exceptions to be as vocal about it as possible, I think, is utterly essential. Was there anything else you mentioned which I haven't addressed? Well, absolutely. Although it's not a massive sector, it's one which is concentrated in a small number of places. Actually, one is Nottingham specifically, where Heckler and Koch, which this is worth mentioning because it was in the news earlier this week, actually. A major report by German charities found that Heckler and Koch, which has been linked to selling weapons to Colonel Gaddafi, has been linked to selling weapons to, Saudi Arabia, it's known about, has been linked to its weapons being used in civil wars in Sudan. Basically, anywhere there's a conflict in the world, Heckler and Koch are making money from it. And the reports which came out this week, it's featured in The Guardian, specifically said that Heckler & Koch does a lot of its business in Britain as opposed to Germany because it's lighter restrictions, less transparent, and it's far less likely your arms sale will get stopped. So one of the reasons why a lot of these companies do take advantage of the UK is because as much as we're told it's a rigorous, robust arms export control system, the exact opposite is the case, and the arms companies know it. And if you want to see that in action, you should definitely come to BAE Systems AGM this May. And it will be an enlightening experience. We totally hope that our shares lose all value. There's no profit we're making from this. It doesn't even pay for the trains to get there, and they're so minor. But yes, I would thoroughly urge you all to go along to those and to actually read the arms company reports, because you can see that the extent to which they almost celebrate conflict. Because as I said right at the start, it's war and conflict which keeps them in business. I realise that was a very long answer, and I think there's a couple of other hands I saw up.
Just a quick one, I hope. You mentioned that the arms trade, at least in the UK, was quite a concentrated force, quite a small force, which had sort of a great amount of influence. Obviously, it's also quite pervasive, reaching globally across to nations like Saudi Arabia. And with a trade that is pervasive like that, once the UK should we be in a case where where CAAT is successful, and the arms trade is stopped, someone else might come in to fill that demand for Saudi Arabia. So how do we go from a relatively local action where our country has taken a stand to that actually having an effect in a broader case?
No problem. This is actually, I thought about putting this in the counter-argument section of the speech I gave, but then erased it for time purposes, but I should have included it, because it is one which comes up. It is that argument which the government makes quite routinely itself, which is if they weren't buying British weapons, they'd be buying someone else's weapons. And the variation you hear on it now is, if they weren't buying our weapons, they'd be buying Russian ones, and they're even less accurate, which is roughly how the argument's been updated. And it's a valid argument. It's one well worth discussing. I think the first thing to highlight about it is the kind of moral bankruptcy of the proposition. It's not an argument you could use in court to justify anything else. The kind of, why did you murder that man? Well, if I didn't do it, someone else would have. You had it coming. And then you can't imagine a judge going, that's a fair point. Not to make light of it, I think the morality of it's certainly very questionable. I don't think that you buy into that morality either. I know you're kind of asking it more in a devil's advocate sort of way. I think to give an answer, we are aware that obviously the UK is a major supplier to Saudi Arabia, but the purpose of this case isn't just to, well, in the short term, it is to end the UK's complicity and push for the UK to do something positive to try and bring about peace in Yemen. But we're also aware that it sets a legal precedent, and European arms export law is, for now, based very much on UK arms export law. And we would hope that a successful legal action taken in the UK could see legal actions taken in Canada, could see legal actions taken in France, could see them taken in the US and other countries as well, which all on paper say that they apply a rigorous, robust arms export policy which does not use weapons to violate international humanitarian law. But also, we would want to see the UK not just ending the arms sales and ending its complicity, but actively changing its foreign policy as well and putting pressure on others to do so. And I totally appreciate that on this issue, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And in this particular issue, our legal action is not, I should clarify, it's not against all arms sales to Saudi Arabia, as much as we'd like to end all arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Our specific legal action is specifically about arms which are for the use in, or being used in Yemen, because that's the legal mechanism we can apply through, and because we do believe they're in strong violation of their own laws. But we obviously, in the long term, want to see all the arms sales stop, and we want to. And I totally appreciate that's not going to happen overnight. It's not as if we can, I can't actually click my fingers anyway. It's something I've never been able to do. But it's not one of those things where we can click our fingers and then war disappears. That's very obvious. But it is one of, and although we're against arms sales more generally, the priority has to be keeping them out of war zones and keeping them away from human rights abusers. And we hope that our legal precedent sets a precedent which can see others asking questions of their own government, but can also see the UK changing its policy and trying to influence other governments more positively.
I think there are a few questions. We'll take them together. No, okay, fine, just one.
You said that Saudi Arabia is the third largest arm buyers from BAE Systems, but who are the first two?
That is the UK and the United States. That's a very short answer, actually. I feel like I've still got 5 minutes to talk about.
Can I ask one as we're in the ladies?
Oh, certainly.
So thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you for listening.
The problem you mentioned about convincing the wider public about the arguments for this. You mentioned that 2/3 are with your argument. Do you mean just 2/3 of obviously the polls? I mean, have you done a widespread poll, or is it just Guardian and independent readers, or?
No, this is consistent polling. If it's Guardian and independent readers, we'd hope it'd be pushing 90.
Okay.
But these are polls which are done by Opinions, a polling agency which we work with. They always do a sample of over 2,000 adults geographically representative of the UK, and we've been doing it for the last 2 or 3 years, and results have been pretty consistent every year.
But what can you do with that? You know, you need to do something with that groundswell of opinion, which is.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, how do you utilise, that opinion into action?
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of those issues which, bearing in mind that 2/3 is a much higher support than any political party in the UK enjoys. So it can't simply be it's all people who vote Green or whatever. It's one of those things which we assume goes across party bases. And one of the issues is, of course, when we're voting in elections, we don't vote on foreign policy generally as a country. We tend to vote on health, education, tax, things like that. We want this issue to be one which moves up the political agenda. And we feel, and certainly it has been moving up it, not as far as we would necessarily want it to, but it certainly has been moving up more over the last few years. And we hope that the more profile it gains, the more people ask their MPs about it, the more MPs start to think I'd better respond to the public on this. But I appreciate that is a long drawn-out process, but then every oak tree begins with an acorn. So it's one of those things as well. I like to think that it's an issue we're making progress on, and certainly I would urge every single one of you to lobby your MP, whoever it is, for North Harrow, and urge them to sign the early day motion, which is currently on the back benches for MPs, to oppose arms exports to Saudi Arabia. I think last I saw it, over 100, I think, and I think every single political party was represented on it, which is good. I think a couple of Northern Irish ones weren't, but most of them are. So I'd urge you to write to your MPs and ask them to raise the issue as well.
Thank you for your talk, and
Thank you.
I sincerely hope you can succeed in this case. This is quite an important case for us. There are 2 or 3 observations I want to make. One is that perhaps we didn't have time to mention the machinations which went on in the parliamentary committee inquiry on this.
Yeah.
And the role of some of the government ministers in their not allowing the right report to be published. Yeah. The second one is, and although it is the arms industry is 0.2% of the workforce, it's a much larger proportion of the value add for the country's revenue. So it's like, I think, 10 to 15%. So that's what counts more than the workforce itself, in terms of if you want to ditch it, for example. You're looking at quite a sizable hole in the beginning, although it can be made up from other things. But I think if you want to change this dynamic, the underlying problem is that with a small country with big ideas about its role in the world, we want to have an army and an armed force and the equipment which is top of the range. This can only be produced cheaply if you have mass production. And mass production means selling the rest to anybody who will buy, whether it's Saudi Arabia or whoever. This is the problem.
Okay.
Because otherwise each of our own Typhoons will cost 10 times what they cost now, because we cannot sell the success, the surplus over there. So I think we have to attack somewhere there to try to rebalance the whole argument.
No problem. I'm going to address each of those in turn. I should say, first of all, you mentioned legal action. I should say that although we are expecting a verdict in the next couple of weeks, we would also anticipate that if we win, I'd anticipate the government will probably appeal it. And if the government wins, we would certainly strongly consider appealing it. So it may not necessarily be the end of the process. To take the questions one by one, the first point you made was about the Committee on Arms Export Control, which I specifically didn't mention because I would avoid, because it would mean using too many acronyms, but I'm going to talk about it a bit now. The Committee on Arms Export Controls is made up of MPs from 4 different committees, which are the Committee for Business Innovation and Skills, International Development, Foreign Affairs and Defence. And they all sit on a Committee for Arms Export Controls, which, although it does not have legally binding powers, is in a position to scrutinise arms exports. And actually, to its credit, has also done, generally speaking, quite a good job of it in the past. Last year, there was a bit of a breakdown in it, because they were doing an inquiry into the legality of UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia. And then they had produced a first draft of a report, which was going to be their conclusions. It has to be representative of all members of the committee. So usually a bit of compromise happens. And it sounded like it was a very strong first draft, which was calling out the UK for violating its own arms export laws. It was all stuff which was very much in line with the kind of arguments we're making in court, actually. Where the breakdown came in was that the paper got leaked to both Newsnight and The Guardian before publication. And then there was a bit of a fight between all the committee chairs and the 4 committees which make up the larger committee. Sorry if this is confusing, I'm going to say committee a lot in this answer. There was a bit of a fight between all the chairs because some of them didn't like that it had been leaked. Now, you could argue it had been leaked by somebody who was sympathetic to our arguments, who was leaking it so that it would bind the committee to making that argument. Or you could view it the other way around, as somebody who was not sympathetic, who was leaking it in order to ensure that the committee would then have a breakdown in relations. It depends how cynical you are. We don't know who leaked it or anything like that, and if we did it, we'd probably tell them it's actually quite inconvenient that they did. But anyway, the leak meant that there was a breakdown in the committee. Now, 2 of the committees released a minority report, which was released by the Committee on International Development and Business Innovation and Skills, which maintained the same line, which said that the UK was clearly in violation of its own arms export policy. The Foreign Affairs Committee, on the other hand, released a slightly weaker one where they diluted it a little bit and kicked into the long grass by saying the legality of it is a matter for the courts, not for Parliament, which in a sense is true because it's being discussed in the courts now, but abdicated from taking a position on it. And the other committee, the Defence Committee, decided that because leaks had happened, it corrupted the entire process and they didn't have any opinion on the matter whatsoever, so they withdrew from it. It was all very confusing and it ended up with 2.5 different reports being released instead of 1. And I think in the end what it did do, unfortunately, was discredit the committee. And it did make a number of the MPs on it call for it to be disbanded. We don't actually know what the future of it is now because it's still being negotiated, with some MPs fairly obviously wanting to scrap it altogether and some wanting to strengthen it. And we don't know how it's going to end up, but that was the controversy on the committee, and that's why it released 2.5 reports which said some fairly strong things, but was also, I think, let down by the fact that there had been this split, and I think the impact of it was reduced because of this as well. We don't know what's going to happen to it in future, but we certainly hope that it stays and that it continues the good work it has been doing, because actually, particularly in the last Parliament under a former Tory Foreign Secretary called Sir John Stanley, who would probably disagree with Campaign Against Arms Trade on almost everything, it actually did a lot of very good scrutinising work and did point out that there's a vast contradiction between talking about human rights and then selling weapons to human rights abusers. So I think that's a large part of it. The second point you raised, I'm right in thinking, was the one which was about the value of exports in relation to the workforce, and the workforce being small, but the value of the sales being very high. This is actually, unfortunately you're wrong. Well, I mean, fortunately, you're wrong in some regard as well. And part of that is because the overall values, you have to bear in mind that when a weapon sells for £1 billion or something like that, a fighter jet deal, we'll say, that at least 40% of that isn't made in the UK to begin with. So actually it's a very misleading top-line figure. The other aspect of it is that the overall total is, as far as I'm aware, it is 1.5% is the value of the exports which comes from the arms trade, which is not an insignificant amount, although it is an amount where, as I say, roughly 40 to 50% of that is actually leaving the UK to begin with. So it's not certainly not on the scale which we would necessarily think it is, because number you said you suspect it would be about 10%. It most definitely isn't, but they do act like an industry which is a massive contributor to GDP. When I was reading about it, I was actually shocked by kind of, in that sense, how small a part of our overall economy it actually is. It's not that economic powerhouse we're always told we have to grin, bear and put up with. And you raised a third point as well. What was that one?
The costing of the local weaponry if we don't sell.
Oh, the point about, yes, the point about if we are to maintain a strong army for the UK, then we need to carry on. It's an argument which comes up a lot, the argument being that as long as the UK is going to have a big, powerful military, then exports are a good way to do that because that makes it more profitable to do and sees more research and development. There's a couple of points about that, which is actually a large part of research and development is funded by taxpayers. There's a really interesting report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which came out a couple of months ago and is on our website, which puts the total public subsidy of arms exports. This is, incidentally, in everything I'm saying, we're putting military procurement and the cost of funding the military to one side. We're talking only about exports. That report put the total subsidy of exports at about anything between 60 and 140 million pounds a year, depending on what year it is. So there's a public money which goes into funding that research and development. But the other aspect of it is that there is a connection between a country which has grand ambitions on the world stage and one which exports a lot of weapons. So it is certainly a link there. It's the same powerful arms companies who are making UK weapons as are making weapons for export. The first thing to say is that we fundamentally disagree with UK foreign policy, which has seen absolutely catastrophic results over the last, well, it's seen catastrophic results for as long as we want to look back, but looking back even within the last 15, 20 years in the post-9/11 era, it's had devastating consequences. The record of the destruction of Iraq is hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and the only ones to benefit from it are ISIS and the oil companies. And we don't want either ISIS or the oil companies to be benefiting from war and destruction. It's seen catastrophic things happening in Afghanistan, seen instability, even greater instability brought to Libya. It's not foreign policy which we believe in, and we don't buy into the argument that Britain needs to be among the, it depends what year it is, it's roughly the 4th or 5th largest military spending country in the world. And we don't believe that it needs to be. We don't believe that foreign policy should be linked to military aggression and to military might and to having the most high-tech equipment possible. And as long as it is, one of the outcomes will be more arms exports because there's an economic argument for it, which I think you made very well in a kind of devil's advocate position. So it isn't just that we want to end arms exports. I think we want to see a fundamental change to UK foreign policy and to the role that the UK plays on the world stage. And I think fundamentally all these issues do come together, and it's a very important discussion to be having. I'm certainly glad we've had it tonight. So I know that was the last question, so thank you very much to all of you who have been a fantastic audience and have all listened to this, and I've certainly thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you and meeting you. Thank you.
Before we end, we actually have a short talk about the, hang on a second, sorry. About an award, the Allama Tabai Award.
So, Assalamu alaikum. Quite a tough act to follow, and thank you very much for that very gripping talk there. So, I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to talk to you about the Allama Tabai Award. So, long name aside, it's an award scheme that was set up a few years ago and is named after the very prestigious and learned scholar Allama Tabai. and it aims to award and recognise the hard work and effort of the youth in our community by awarding them for their GCSE and A-level results. So there are three components to the award, the first being the one that's probably the most interesting for the youth, and that is cash prizes. The second being probably arguably the more important, which is the sort of spiritual nurturing side